Hello, girls and boys. Right, so I'm George from Ireland, and this video is about the Whig view of history. Now, I made a similar video a couple of nights ago, but I foolishly didn't think to do it live stream. In a very silly and mutton-headed manner, I did it the old way. So I'm going to do it live stream because I know it attracts more hits. And yes, to some extent it is bums on seats, because I'm hoping this will build and build and build, and I'll have a huge audience and all the rest, and that will lead to filthy lucre. I am as susceptible to temptations of emolument as the next chap. All right, so the Whig view of history. Well, it's an intellectual tradition, and this is a faith, and it's about the notion of, well, continuity, but change at the same time. It's unchanging insofar as history is moving towards a goal, but obviously the political reality changes over time, and therefore it's right to amend the constitution to reflect that. So I hope this video shan't be over an hour, as the previous iteration was. So first of all, I suppose I better define my terms. What is a Whig? Is W-H-I-G. It's not wig as in peruke, you know, false follicles or horse hair for the human head. Well, the word Whig was originally an abusive term. It meant horse thief in North Britain. And in the Church of Scotland's General Assembly, some people called Whiggamores as an insult in the 1630s, but the name stuck. So it's used more generally from the 1680s onwards. I'm sure you all know about the Oxford Parliament of 1681, the Exclusion Act, when the excluders attempted to exclude James of that name II from succession to the crown. He was known as the Duke of York at the time, not James II, because he was a Catholic, and there was a lot of prejudice in the British Isles against Roman Catholicism. Okay, not in Ireland. James II was going to become King of Ireland, and as a Catholic he had lots of support in our country, but in England and Scotland, and indeed Wales, there was a great deal of animosity towards him, because he was due to become King of England, King of Scots. James II's elder brother was Charles II. Now, Charles II had 20 children. The trouble was, none of them were with his wife. Anyway, so it was evident that his wife, Catherine Braganza, was as barren as a desert, and despite having Bombay as her dowry, so the crown would solely and rightfully pass to the king's brother. Would he be a Roundhead or a Cavalier? Zach Grant Butler, the agony of choice. Would I be right but repulsive, or were wrong but were romantic, as Butler and Yeats put it in 1066 and all that? I find it difficult to say, because obviously Charles I was a woeful king. On the other hand, Cromwell's a Puritan and all the rest of it, and viciously anti-Catholic. I sometimes think I'd mildly before Charles I, but he's an absolute monarch. Anyway, back to the question. So the excluders wish to exclude James II from the crown on the basis of his Roman Catholicism, and the abhorrers, they abhorred the idea. Remember, everybody in the Parliament of England and Wales was an Anglican, almost without exception. But despite that, members of the Church of England were willing to say, we will have a Catholic monarch, because the king is the king, that's it. Anyway, but the bill was actually passed. But Charles II said, I refuse to sign it into law. That's it. What are you going to do about it? Do you want a civil war, another civil war? And nobody in his right mind wanted that, so the bill fell. I shan't tell you the whole rest of 1685, of the succession of James of that name of the second, 1688, and indeed what happened in Ireland in 1690. But anyway, so those who wanted to exclude James II were known as excluders, but then they were dubbed Whigs, and it was an abusive term. Whereas those who wished to block that and say, no, James II has the right to inherit the crown, they were abhorrers, as they abhorred the very idea, known as Tories, from the Irish word chara, the Irish language meaning pursuer, literally, which would just mean an armed robber. because why the association with Ireland? Because 75% of us or so were Catholics, and that was that. So, and of course, the Protestant community in Ireland at the time, they were principally derived of those of recent English and Scots immigrant stock, usually call themselves English and or Scots, Welsh, even Manx, and that was that, and couldn't speak the Irish language. Anyway, so from that time on, the Whigs and the Tories were the two parties in the British Isles. Yes, in Ireland as well as in Great Britain. Though in Ireland, by the late 18th century, I don't think anyone in Ireland called himself a Tory. Even in Great Britain, Tory became decidedly unpopular. The so-called Tories often dubbed themselves Pittites in the late 18th century. So, for Whigs, there are certain eternal truths, all right? Some things are good, some things are bad. There are heroes and anti-heroes. What am I doing on Halloween? I'm frightening you. I did see the group of people going along trick-or-treating, and the mum was got up as a witch, and the little children were various frightful outfits. And I said, "Oh, it's a witch." And the little girl said, "Where's the witch?" I was saying, "Her." Okay, so as though the outfit had worked. Anyway, where did I get to? So, eternal truths that they believe that history is a perpetual battle for mastery between tyranny and liberty. So the small c conservative insight is that human nature is immutable. I was speaking to an exceptionally erudite and wise friend of mine only yesterday night, and he was saying, isn't that the curious thing, that whatever the political dispensation, people will try to do the best by their children, however unfair that might be, even under communism, a system which was supposedly absolutely egalitarian. So what happens when constraints are removed? Is a human the beast unbound? Do we need these restraints or not? It's a question which can be debated till the bovines come home. Anyway, so Whigs, they favoured parliamentarianism. The Tories wanted that too. The Whigs say that they were guided by reason. Who are you voting for this general election? Conservative. And the Whigs would say they're not hidebound by tradition. They are characterised by hostility to absolute monarchy and indeed to despotism. Believe that the regal power needs to be limited, that the monarch should be largely symbolic. Could I have a reason? Well, not in the middle of this video. Come on, hold your wheesht. So the Whigs favoured organised freedom as they would see it. So they don't want to license or libertarianism. There wouldn't be libertines, well, not officially. Some of them were in their private lives. They would view the state as a machine, as it were, in that if something is rusty, it can be removed and replaced. Whereas Tories would say, it's more like a living being, pulsating, as we were. And you can't simply take an organ out of it and cast it aside. The whole thing will die, however bad it was. You can be selfish or greedy in any system, true. Can you believe a brief explanation of Brexit for dummies? Oh my God, Brexit is British exit, it's about the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. J Bugs humbug, a great turn of phrase. Well, I do pride myself on that. I try and polish a few. All right, so the Whigs, I suppose they're a bit melioristic, as in believing we can improve things, and things are improving anyway, almost without human agency. There's a sort of an air of inevitability about it to them. And so the Whigs believe that power must be diffused and restrictions must be placed on the executive in particular. Because remember, at the time prior to the Whigs emerging as a distinct force, the power of monarchs was almost untrammeled in Ireland and Great Britain, and indeed beyond the seas. Why conservative? For all sorts of reasons. By observation, by inclination, tradition, continuity, these things please me, might and majesty. But obviously I'm somewhat a classical liberal. You can see the other videos in which I adumbrate my political views and the process by which I arrived thereat. Anyhow, so the Whigs became more distinct in the 18th century. And remember, under the monarchs of the 18th century in the British Isles, the Whigs were in office, certainly the earlier half. Indian or Chinese, India, okay, India represents liberty. Put it this way, where would be more likely to have a fair trial, India or China? There's no contest. It's Bharat wins hands down. So, Sir Robert Walpole, the first Prime Minister, was a Whig, as were most of them, up to including Pitt the Younger. After that, it's more even Stevens, the late 18th century. But so they said, oh yes, the Enlightenment, we fairly approve of that. But there were limits. They still supported laws against blasphemy or sedition. So I know we say that they grew into the Liberals and then the Liberal Democrats, but they were very much men of their time, and I do mean men. Women having the right to vote. Are you out of your tree? Until the 1790s, nobody proposed that. And if you said that, even then, you had your tiny little gourd. I like mutton korma. So the Whigs could still support religious discrimination, and the whole thing about attempting to prevent James II acceding to the crown is they said, oh, Catholicism, well, that's really coterminous with absolutism. So and then so many of them supported kicking him out. So the Whigs approved of religious discrimination and practiced it. Which uni did I go to? I went to Oxford University for my first 2 degrees, and then I went to, well, I've got a degree from the University of London in law, and I got a master's degree from the University of Limerick in linguistics. I have this qualification called CELTA, about teaching English as a foreign language. I have that from the University of Cambridge, and oh yes, I have a diploma from the London School of Journalism, and I've got this TEFL qualification from Global English College. Can't think what else. Oh yeah, I'm an examiner in oral English because I know something about speaking English. Where was I? Anyhow, so the Whigs would say that they are rational, but nevertheless they're into hero worship. And do you know what ASMR is? No, enlighten me. So the Whigs would claim to have intellectual rigor and to be unbiased in their assessment of history, but isn't that plain silly when they set things up as antipodes? They're heroes and anti-heroes. They're dualistic. They perceive history as a Manichaean battle. So they are afflicted by numerous weaknesses, the sort of debilities that scar the history of people who have an agenda to advance. This is known as motivated rationalism. So you can see the observer bias there, because you're involved in this, you see it from a particular angle. It's basically when you eat food loudly on YouTube. Shows what I know. And again, confirmation bias, which is striving to find sources which are likely to bolster your viewpoint. What do I do as a living? Well, I'm a private tutor. I am a political analyst. And let me see, I'm a tour guide. I'm a translator. The Liberal Party of Rise of the Whigs, well, they did, but it's a highly complex story, because the Tories became the Conservatives in the private tutor for what all sorts of subjects. I say so at the end of many videos, humanities subjects. In the 1830s, the Tories became Conservatives, and the Whigs didn't become Liberals as such. Really, to the 1850s, they could only agree on one thing. Various MPs meeting in Vincent's room in the House of Commons agree on Italian independence and various other issues. But it's hard to recall now that in the late 19th century, they dominated politics. And there was a long period when they managed to keep the Conservatives out of office. And coming into the 20th century, it seemed like the Liberals may well dominate things. Labour was too left, the Conservatives were too right, and there were the Liberals in the middle. The natural party of government, almost. And Harold Wilson, indeed, who coined the phrase natural party of the government, he was an erstwhile Liberal. Are you good at geography because all your vids consist of history? Well, I am, but what can I really say about geography ad infinitum here? Ask me a geographical question. No, I don't know every mountain in the world. Could you do geography once? Well, I know, but geography really need a map. I'm into human geography, not so much physical geography. Unless we're talking about the female body. Anyhow, so the Whigs had this sort of presumption that there was the embryo of parliamentary government in the Britannic psyche, always. Which is really an evidenceless proposition. It's a very unsafe presumption. So Whig historiography is heavily prejudiced and was tainted by contemporary debates. It was just contaminated by this need to dish the Tories and to adulate, to build up the Whigs their own brand. Anyway, they were eager on recruiting past protagonists into current political debates. People long since dead that say, well, he was on our side and he was on the other side because he was a baddie. and it was a nunc pro tunc. You know, it's a real weakness. We mustn't have that. So they would retrospectively try to allocate people into this camp or that camp, which they shouldn't do. Did you listen to Farage's shameful interview on LBC with Trump? No, I didn't actually. Farage used to have a lot of time for. He dined with me years ago, and now he's a Trump worshipper. Do you believe everyone should move to urbanized areas? No, I don't. I'm very much an urban person. I live in Londinium, as you may have guessed. A very serious question. How was the difference between the old and the new trade unionism in the 19th century and the 20th century? Oh my goodness. Well, I don't really know. In the late 19th century, workers had very few rights. There are few limitations on on working hours, but that was about it. I don't really know how much it changed through the 20th century because obviously the trades unions got bigger, the Labour Party got fairly mighty, women joined trades unions, and the sort of 1950s, the trade unions are very mighty. By the end of the 20th century, they're actually quite weak. Trades union membership had contracted. How many bedrooms does your house have? It looks really nice. Quite a few. Can you do a tour? I don't really feel like doing a tour right now. Did you watch a previous video in which I show you most of it? But you know, this is what YouTube can buy you. I'm highly successful, worth investing in. Okay, so book lessons, book guided tours with me. They're yours for a song. You know, for amount of my wealth, I really don't charge very much. I do it largely, you know, for fun. But what can I say? Never give people things for free. Okay, this video is, because then they think, you know, you have no value. Do I have a lot of money? Well, no, I wouldn't say so, but I'm not poor. Put it like this. Rich in spirit, the things that count. Anyway, so the difference between poverty and wealth is qualifications. Not always, but for the most part, they are. Say, blah, blah, blah dropped out of college, but he's a billionaire. Okay, there'll be 1 in a million who's like that. But by and large, that's true. I remember speaking to this cleaner years ago, this poor woman, and she was earning poverty pay, working long hours, doing something she loathed. And I thought, well, why do I work short hours for a good salary, doing something very easy, enjoyable? Why? Qualifications. No, I'm woeful at maths. When I need to count over the number 10, I have to pull down my trousers. Figure it out. All right. Anyway, so the thing about Whiggism is it was motivated by present political perceptions, or present at that time, and those cloud judgment, I submit. It was almost millenarian, as there'd be sort of an end of time showdown, a cosmic clash of the titans between the two forces. And it's redolent of Francis Fukuyama. You may have heard of that American historian who penned The End of History and the Last Man around about 1990, when communist regimes were falling like ninepins. And he said, really, the American way, that is the future. We have got more or less a perfect society. All right, a few niggles to sort out, but this is it. Our constitution, our economic model. People are going to emulate it, and that's it. It's sorted. What are my views on Islam? My goodness. Well, I don't believe it. Not every word of it is bogus. I think you can see other videos of mine. Some of it's laudable, some of it's not. I don't think we should have Islamic privilege, and I'm worried that's creeping in some Western societies, to be uniquely exempt from scrutiny and criticism. Now, there's some people who go too far the other way, and they excoriate it, and they're just frankly bigoted against Muslims, which is obviously despicable. The Muslims can be very good, morally upstanding people. They could be terrible. They could be neutral. So that's that. I'm not going to stop people practicing Islam. They're things which say break the law, but are they Islamic? Like honor killings, is that to do with Islam or not? Female genital mutilation, some Muslims, most Muslims say it has no connection to Islam at all, but certainly in Western countries, it's almost exclusively Muslims who do that. Some of them say it's their faith. Is it not the faith? It's a custom, it's a culture. I don't know. So most Muslims are fine. There are baddies in every religion, but I'm sorry to say that their rebarbative attitudes seem to be more widespread amongst Islamic communities than elsewhere. They don't like cartoons. Well, some of them don't. Well, that's another thing about freedom of expression. We have the right to be rude, to insult anything, really slaughter all sacred cows any religion, or Margaret Thatcher, whoever it is, and I might get mortally offended, but I wouldn't say you're not permitted to do so. You mentioned on teaching in China. How do you find the experience? Not terribly agreeable, actually. I'm not rushing back to Far Cathay. So back to the Whigs. No, indeed, there was American Whiggism. And by the time of the American Revolution, most of them regard themselves as Whigs, thinking they're more reform-minded. But really, there wasn't much between the Tories and the Whigs at the time. Please do not ask questions unrelated to the Whig party system. Yes, it tends to derail my train of thought. Surely someone of your intelligence believes the Bible is the truth. No, I don't. Well, it's not every word of it's false. It mentions Caesar Augustus. Did he exist? He's a very well contested figure. There are multiple documents which corroborate his existence and so forth. Yes, there was a pharaoh in Egypt. I believe it to that extent. But do I believe in the supernatural side? No, I don't. Obviously, the Bible contradicts itself many times. 2 creation myths in Genesis. I'm because I'm not a moron. Think of a number 1 to 10. Don't say it and double it now. Okay, I have. Anyway, so the trouble about Whigs, I have done so, is that they try to exalt. Yes, I've done it. They try to exalt or vilify people in the past, and they claim that people in previous centuries were on their side, or indeed were their foes, and they're always connecting it to present political preconceptions. Oh my God, this bit minus the number with your original number. Yeah, I've done that. Okay, from your original number, I think you mean. Take my current number and subtract my original number. Yes, I've done it. So you're right. I don't know how you do that. It work for any number, does it? He said 5. It's correct. So they presume that this thing was inescapable, the way it was going to pan out in future. They consider themselves as world historical tipsters, as though you've got some sort of crystal ball or something of that nature. That it was preordained this is going to happen. How do they know this was destined to happen? It reminds me of Protestantism. Yes, I do want to know how. And they were obviously Protestants to a man, except in the early 19th century in Ireland, where actually Catholics tend to support Whigs and Tories were mostly Conservatives. No, I'm not going to pay any money to know. So, because remember some Calvinists believed in predestination. So it's as though history was, what's the word, something that was programmed in advance, and it was bound to happen this way or that. They believed that they could reshape society, and how could they order things like that? They think there was change. I suppose they thought that people did it. It wasn't a divinely ordained thing. Leopold von Ranke, I remember reading him as an undergraduate, seemed complete bunkum to me. This late 19th century German historian believed that there were these wars and God favored this side or that, according to their moral force. It was clearly nonsensical. Who could believe in such tripe? Anyhow, so the Whigs, they had their various shibboleths. They would look back to Magna Carta, to the Bill of Rights and so forth, and perceiving these as palladia of freedom. So there's this line of causation in history. I'm not sure how they're going to prove it led to here and there. And they regarded patterns as existing where none existed. And this is one of our cognitive abilities. I can't remember what it's called. I ought to read up on psychology more. The way we tend to see patterns when they're not there. And we like to order things, we like to categorize things, it to be neat, it to be comprehensible. And it's much more difficult, I'm sorry to say, may sound conceited, but you have to be cleverer and braver to actually acknowledge we don't know. And it's not satisfying to say that it's just a mess and it defies any easy categorization. It's not systemic. So there was this presumption that the British way was inherently superior, that everybody should copy it and so on. It's a trap that many Americans fall into, and it's difficult to avoid if you come from a mighty nation. Like you look at Americans now the United States is top nation, or the Soviet Union when that was a superpower, increasingly the Chinese, haughty like this, and believing that their way is automatically better than everyone else, and people are wrong-headed if they don't simply wish to follow them. That it just isn't blindingly obvious to you. it's really self-evident that our way is the best way, and you should want to be like us. And if you don't want to be like us, there's something deeply wrong with you. Ask me another time to make a 1066 video. So it's as though they think that this is the very pinnacle of human achievement and constitutional development. The constitutional monarchy, such as existed in Ireland and Great Britain, and ought to be copied everywhere, could be replicated by other countries. It's a bit like in George III, that film, The Mad King George, where Pitt the Younger, although he's probably a Tory with a Whig father, said, "We tell ourselves our system is the envy of the world," but he says so dryly cynical, as though he doesn't believe it. Anyhow, okay, sorry there, Ian Dale, lucky chap has beat me. Yes, some systems are better, not all social systems are better. And the thing is, they're not all necessarily applicable to all countries. Some principles might have to be disapplied in a certain situation, even in some country where they're generally applied. So they have this trite view of historical figures, and they make slender allowance for nuance or what the situation was at a particular time. So it's clumsy, sometimes fatuous. Whig history, is it just frank polemic? Anyhow, so it's a very rich irony that so many Whigs, they really fell victim to the same sort of illusions that they often allege against their counterparts, well, their adversaries on the other side of the political divide. They deceive themselves so often. So the Tory system is much more intellectually modest and is suspicious of grand theorizing. These would be noxious to mankind, as Edmund Burke would say. Although Edmund Burke started out as a Whig anyway, not quite clear what is the end, but both Whigs and Tories trying to claim him. Indeed, they would be deeply dubious about ideology at all. Tories, even today, some conservatives say they're non-ideological. Others say, well, come on, that's bull. They just don't want to face up to it. That claiming they're expedient, well, really, they're not. Their idée fixe was Brexit, some would say. So the Whig view of history is about this battle between tyranny and parliamentary government. The Whigs are for parliamentary government. Go to Bowood House in Western England, I think it's Wiltshire, and that was the home of the Marquis of Lansdowne, Whig politico. Indeed, Lansdowne Road in Dublin, our national rugby stadium, is named after him. So it was a prime minister of Great Britain, an Irishman. Shelburne's the surname, as in seat of the Britons, someplace in Wexford. So anyway, you could take a stroll through his gardens and walk past the Whig pantheon of various figures from ancient Greece and Rome, Brutus among them, who poignarded to death Julius Caesar for his regal pretensions, remembering Rex was a four-letter word to the Romans. Caesar making himself dictator for life, abrogating the constitution. He's supposed to be consul jointly for 1 year only, was consul, sole consul for 12 years, and all the rest of it. But was he a backstabber, Brutus? That's the way Tories might see it. And the Tories would be too susceptible to the blandishments of these military strongmen. Caudillismo. Anyway, so Republicans in Rome said that Caesar was hell-bent on putting out the lamp of liberty and ending this rule of the Senate, which was sort of about wise aristocrats. Someone from Wexford is contacting me. So Caesarism is dangerously appealing to the dim-witted because it's about chauvinism. Some people are gullible. They are blinded by the glitter of military glory and things like that, the cult of the personality. And it is very appealing to people of limited cognitive ability, to the dark masses, the lower orders, the great unwashed, hoi polloi, call them what you will. Okay, the plebeians, and he was indeed a tribune of the assembly of the plebs. So the Whigs would say, we set our face against concessions to the vulgar mob. Seriously, what is a Whig? I was telling you, it's a political party in the British Isles and other countries. Very informal political party, an outlook, but believing in parliamentary government, as in execrating Julius Caesar and adulating Brutus, even though obviously Rome was a republic at the time, and the Whigs didn't advocate a republic. So they believe that there are demagogues out there, and you must stand up to them. Césarisme populaire. No, the Conservatives grew out of the Tories, actually. It's very complicated because you have a faction breaking off one party, moving over to the others, a faction breaking off this party, moving to the other. So it's not a completely obvious linear descendant. Okay, there's a lot of crisscrossing, political cross-dressing. So Napoleon the Great, as in Napoleon Bonaparte, the Whigs would say, oh, isn't he terrible? He's a military dictator. He's the sort of fiend who is very attractive to dim-witted people who just sort of want to kowtow before a despot. Napoleon III, nephew of Napoleon the Great, same story. And the Tories weren't keen on them either, that Corsican parvenu. So in South America, Caesar is used as a name for boys, and there have been a few sawdust Caesars down there. So the Whig view of history is teleological. They assume that progress necessarily occurs, and that there's as though history is moving towards an objective, like an endpoint perfection, like some sort of demi-paradisical situation. So it's very much Britocentric, more broadly Eurocentric. It takes little account of what happened outside the British Isles. So the Whigs existed in some shape from the late 17th century into the mid-19th century, so 300 years at the outset. Sir James Mackintosh in the early 19th century, he was an advocate of theirs. So Lord Macaulay attempted to vindicate Whiggism. So Terence Babington Macaulay, this Londoner, was partly Scots. He wrote many a swelling scene, but his prose would now be considered turgid, maybe even tumid and bombastic, sententious. I remember reading his History of England. It's a multi-volume History of England. He didn't quite finish it. And I read it in 2008 when I went on that holiday to Barbados. So there he is, adulating the Whigs whilst he's seeking to excoriate the Tories, writing about King Louis of France, Louis XIV in particular, but spelling it Louis, L-E-W-I-S, singing that the French monarchy stands for absolute monarchy and what would the word be, just as unlimited regal power. Earl Grey tea is named after the Whig Prime Minister. Earl Grey, spot on, it is. Charles Grey, you ever seen the Duchess? That young man who is the lover of the Duchess of Devonshire. He's the chap who became Prime Minister. Lord Grey of the Reform Bill, and indeed a collateral ancestor of Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary at the outbreak of the First World War. So, anyway, Lord Macaulay, he was a Whig Member of Parliament, and his best-known dictum is reform that you may preserve, in relation to that self-same Great Reform Act that my spectator mentioned. The viewer mentioned the Representative Act 1832, but commonly called the Great Reform Act, because Macaulay said we want to keep the same constitution. However, from time to time we must update it to reflect current political realities, and that's really a Whiggism in a nutshell. That they do see continuity, but they recognise in order to manage that, one needs to modernise sometimes in view of changed circumstances. So he goes back to the 1688 revolution, which Whigs were not ashamed to describe as the Glorious Revolution, and Tories often said that as well, actually, because I know the Tories have said, oh, we can't exclude James II, but in 1688, when there's a rebellion against him, so mostly Tories joined that side as well, actually. They're fed up with James II after only 3 years. The invitation to William, written by the immortal Seven, as in to William, the Stadtholder of the Netherlands, William of Orange, to come to England for various reasons to investigate this supposedly supposititious infant, as in the child of James II. James III, the Jacobites would call him. That was signed by 4 Whigs and 3 Tories, members of Parliament, and indeed the Bishop of London, Spencer Compton. And indeed, one of his descendants, another Compton, was the Earl of Wilmington, was prime minister, a Whig prime minister, in the mid-18th century, time of the first controversies regarding the baker's dozen of colonies. So anyway, for Thomas Babington Macaulay, 1688 was a year that was illumined in glory eternally. And he said it's because there was this preserving revolution to maintain parliamentary institutions in 1688 that the British Isles didn't have a destroying revolution in the 19th century. And indeed, this is the source of unending historiographical debate. Why is it almost alone of major European countries, the British Isles did not have a revolution in the 18th century or indeed the 19th century? Well, there was one in the 17th century, but was it really a revolution? Yes, one king was chased out, or did he abdicate? That was the hypothetical construction of the revolutionists. But not a great deal changed, but perhaps it copper-fastened parliamentary supremacy, and the monarchy really being the creature of Parliament, since the Parliament had arrogated to itself the right to alter the line of succession by the Succession Act, and so forth. So Lord Macaulay, he published his famous, or perhaps infamous, Minutes on Education in India, and it was an exceptionally significant piece of bureaucracy, saying the language of instruction shall no longer be Persian. The medium of instruction in Indian schools should be English. Obviously, it took a very long time to take effect before most Indian schools taught through English. So he believed in educating Indians, but the fact that he really meant Britannicizing them. Okay, most people all over the world were illiterate. The British Isles was one of the few regions of the world in which most people were illiterate in the early 19th century, even if to a very low standard. And he believed this would make Indians capable of self-governance. Now, Indians might find that mortally offensive. That was Macaulay's view. I didn't say it was mine. And so he made some exceptionally disparaging remarks about Indian learning as though it was virtually worthless, whilst in the same breath acknowledging that he was completely ignorant thereof. So it showed this sort of cultural supremacy, which was really not warranted. Anyhow, Thomas Carlyle in the 19th century, that Scotsman, lived in London. I've made a video at his house. He invented so many words, I don't remember them right now. But he was another Whig historian, really, in believing largely the same trajectory. And then there was William Stubbs, who was the first Regius Professor of History at the Oxford University. I dined with another as a schoolboy. I say that Regius Professor is a professorship set up by the Crown, because and then people could study history solely. Up at that time, as an undergraduate, you studied, well, a general course, but you could pick and mix them, gather them between, doing a lot of this stuff through Latin and ancient Greek, but history, geography, philosophy, literature, some modern languages, maths, the sciences, blah, blah, blah. But he said, no, you can't do solely one subject, history. You will have to read some of it through Latin and Greek, but that's it. And indeed, he was the Bishop of the Church of England, remembering in the two great English universities, they had a very intimate relationship with the church, and the fellows of the colleges were virtually all in holy orders until the 1870s. Obviously, Catholic clergy to the 1530s, Anglican clergy thereafter. So look at William Edward Hartpole Lecky, that Don at Trinity College Dublin, and indeed he's memorialised by a big statue in Front Square in Trinity. Now, if more people realise that, I suppose they're probably trying to have it removed, because he was a Conservative MP for Dublin University, and he thought really that the landed classes ought to be in charge, and he thought that the situation in Ireland prior to the Act of Union was highly delightful. But wait a second, most of us were Catholics who were discriminated against. Well, I don't know if he approved of that. It didn't seem to allow to disapprove of it. He died very shortly after the start of the 20th century. But he said the Act of Union should not have been passed. But now that it has been passed, we have to accept that. We can't put the genie back in the bottle because most people have the vote. So we're just going to have to preserve the Union. We can't, in Ireland, split from Great Britain because we'll have the mob in charge and they'll wreck things. Anyway, Sir George Trevelyan, that mid-20th century bureaucrat, he was a Whig civil servant and historian. There's a college at Durham University named in his honour. And his grandfather, Sir Charles Trevelyan, notoriously was a civil servant who had a great deal of say over Irish affairs in the 19th century, when many of us were starving to death. You may know that song from The Fields of Athenry. I stole Trevelyan's corn that the young might see the morn. So some of the relief food was set not enough, claiming we're no good at husbandry. Anyway, would choose us to make us dependent and not self-reliant, and for fuck's sake, we're dying. Just feed us. And okay, the government did feed us, but not enough food was sent. Anyhow, so the line goes, I stole Trevelyan's corn that the young might see the morn, stealing from a government warehouse so your children don't die. And in the song, a man gets sent to Van Diemen's Land, or no, so New South Wales, transported as a prisoner. Remember, in 1868, people could be punished with a fate worse than death, transportation to Australia. Okay. So the Whigs favour some very, very harsh punishments. So they are vigorously partisan. And you could say they're not really intellectually firm enough, they're too emotional. So David Hume carried out an elegant sort of hatchet job on Whig history in the mid-18th century with his history of England. Notice not a history of Great Britain, even though he was in North Britain. Butterfield in the mid-20th century more or less did the same. Demolished it. First World War, it was no longer en vogue. There was his essay, Continuity and Anachronism, by Blas after it. And he says, actually, that Whiggery was more or less gone by 1914. So it was hard to persuade everyone that people were getting better mechanization, when we slaughtered people far more efficiently than ever before. It reminds me of that, what's the word? Is it aphorism? What do you call those poems with a sting in the tail? 4-line poem. Never mind, it'll come to me. The Romans were fond of them. This is called Christmas 1915 by Thomas Hardy. Peace on earth, we sing it, and pay 1,000,000 priests to bring it. After 2,000 years of mass, we've got as far as poison gas. So he's been very cynical. Happy Halloween, suggesting, okay, we do all this praying. Has it made us better, more humane, better to our fellow man? No, it's made us slaughter each other with scientific knowledge. So what was the Liberal Party trying to sort out in the Edwardian era, the Edwardian crisis, some people call it? Home rule for Ireland, dealing with the growing threat of the Labour Party, keeping trades unions happy, building up the welfare state. It was really, it is cradle at the time. Let me see, the temperance issue, restricting alcohol sales, electoral reform, maintaining free trade, building the armed forces, and so forth. A dip into the strange death of liberal England by George Dangerfield, that British-American historian, saying how it all went wrong shortly before the First World War, which is why the Liberal Party in 1922 was the second biggest party, was pushed into third place, and 1923 the election pushed into third place, and have never ever recovered almost a century on. Okay, once in that century they've been a minor party in a coalition. So the Whigs purport to believe that those who have a stake in the country ought to have a say in it. You have to own a lot of realty and then be allowed to vote. So only men of consequence should be allowed to vote. And only very affable men should be allowed to stand for election. Therefore, Parliament can make and unmake laws. It controls money bills. House of Lords had that power till the First World War and can hold ministers to account, perform this critical analysis role of the executive. So those with property can stand for Parliament. And the system for electing people and distributing seats is imperfect, but, all right, some minor corrections are needful. They accepted a hereditary element to Parliament and said that peers are randomly selected, which makes them independent. That's a laudable thing. They thought that monarchy wasn't completely compatible with this, but it ought to be restricted and just be like a living symbol, be a figurehead, not actually exercise sovereignty. So they believed that certain rights were crucial. People had the right to a fair trial before an impartial tribunal, and nobody should be incarcerated without just cause. Guilt must be proved. There must be the presumption of innocence. No one should have his property taken away except when it was a punishment lawfully handed down by a court. The judiciary must be independent and so on, and people must be allowed freedom of speech. But they did say blasphemy is not allowed, treason is not allowed. But beyond that, it is, you can say what you want. So they said we mustn't have a standing parliament without the consent, standing army without the consent of Parliament, lest that you be used to bulldoze Parliament as continental despots would do. A police force so closely resembles an army that they were deeply suspect about that. And indeed, it was a Tory Home Secretary who set up the police. Parish constables are different. They don't have a uniform or indeed a firearm. So Catholics, we were not allowed to take part in politics because our church supposedly sanctified despotism. Now, okay, there weren't plenty Catholic dictatorships. There were a few Protestant ones. So there's a link between Protestantism and parliamentary government was not essential. So anyway, they said that Catholicism is too authoritarian, it's an unthinking religion and so on. There was this idea that Protestantism emancipates the mind and so on. You should read that Protestantism, the Spirit of Capitalism by Max Weber. They said that only people with wealthy money or wealthy or independent are not susceptible to being bribed by a small amount of money. But come on, those who hanker after filthy lucre, no matter how rich, might sell their vote. So they said they are supposed to be men of leisure in politics who devote their time to public service solely being actuated by a desire to serve the common good. So they don't care for ignoramuses and penniless people, the impecunious, well indeed just the averagely well off, which should be disbarred from voting. So they said that Whigs believed that the upper orders were best to safeguard and uphold the liberties of the commons. And these men with time on their hands, they were serving the public. That was the idea. They could read reams and reams of parliamentary debates, listen to lengthy orations, and they did this without a penny in compensation. But they weren't doing it for emolument. Oh, come on. They framed laws to suit themselves. They believed in checks and balances, that no one organ of the state ought to be overmighty. It's redolent of Lord Acton's dictum, power tends to corrupt and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. He didn't say power corrupts, he said it tends to corrupt. It's so often misquoted. So we all know that good people can turn rotten, and indeed bad people can be reformed. So we mustn't allow people to run away with their worst instincts, their wickedry, their foolishness. These must be kept in check. They thought that the British Constitution, being uncodified, was the best possible amalgam of the three elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and an elected element, I shan't say, democracy. So they often thought democracy was dreadful because it had failed so signally in Greece, and they didn't want to cave into the swinish multitude, as Edmund Burke termed most people. So they thought most people are staggeringly ignorant, and remember in the 18th century most people were completely unlettered. These people are scarcely civilized, indeed they're bigoted, they have little idea what's in their own best interests, they would sell their birthright for a mess of pottage, they would be easily gulled by a fork-tongued demagogue. So they could be duped into giving away their freedom by a politician's sweet talk, and they would abolish these sacred liberties. They would confiscate property. So watch out for these silver-tongued, smooth-talking orators. People could be stampeded by fear into getting rid of right to a trial by jury and stuff like that. So ignorant people could easily be gulled into believing a false faith, and they would cause for things which are really outright barbarous to be done. The crowd is too emotive, and they are never rational. They have no critical faculty, as Hitler said, and that would be tyrannical. We can have tyranny of the majority. A foolish and poverty-stricken person might actually prefer dictatorship, might do better out of it. So they would easily be seduced by the splendor of a military regime or something like that. So the mob is disgusting, and they shouldn't ever be permitted to take any part in politics. So order must be maintained against the mob, but it mustn't be order that's too strong, that's tyrannical. Politicians have to be manhandled, have to be spat at, they have to have, the rotten vegetables thrown at them, and they have to be regularly battered by howling mobs. That happened in the 18th century, their windows smashed, and that was the price of a free society, and politicians were willing to pay it. You might exchange your right to vote for the right to beat up politicians. So if you look back at the 18th century, you can see popular hobbies well. This is why the Whigs took the view that their fellow man was really bestial. People went out to enjoy a good hanging. That was public entertainment. So life was violent and extreme. There were bear baitings and badger baitings. People paid to go around lunatic asylums to see the lunatics, them being chained up, them being goaded and so on. Hair coursing, it was all very bloody. Seeing going to the madhouse like going to the zoo, it was bedlam. People getting blind drunk on gin till tax made it more expensive. Gin had no nutrition, unlike beer. See Hogarth, Gin Lane, and all the rest of that. So most people were filthy. They wore rags. Went barefoot. So the discalced masses, they were just scarcely human. People had no running water. People were so unhygienic. Teeth rotten out of their head by the time they're 20. So that the lower orders were so disreputable, they must not be allowed to vote at all. And the poor were less likely to worship, and this was really crucial for respectability. The church was regarded as the source of all goodness and morality, so a respectable person had to be seen in church a Sunday. Remember, the wealthy paid for pews to be set aside for them, and the working class didn't attend very much to the cities. They were too ashamed of their bad clothes. Vulgarity, venality, drunkenness, that's what Lord Salisbury said the working class were characterised by in the late 19th century. Anyway, so tyrants would like arbitrary rule. And tyranny is what happens when parliamentary government is done away with, but democracy might lead to it as well. So there must be trial by juries and freedom of worship for sensible denominations. What's sensible? Difficult to say. They didn't actually want to ban Catholicism or Islam or something like that. Anyway, the Whigs said we must be ever vigilant against would-be tyrants who would exploit a war or something to take away our civil liberty, break down law and order. There will be the rise of a dictator like Cromwell, major generals everywhere, cancelling Christmas, closing the theatre. We can't have that. It's better to have the limited influence of constitutional monarchy, because better the devil you know, than the unlimited power of a military dictator or something. So it must be run by these representative institutions. Well, really, they're actually fairly unrepresentative. Anyway, so they believe that history demonstrated that there was step-by-step progress towards parliamentary government. You could widen the franchise bit by bit by bit, bringing more people within the pale of the Constitution. Most people were too moronic to be allowed to vote, but as people became more educated, we could allow more and more people to vote. We mustn't have trades unions, combination acts against them, because they would intrude on the rights of property. We can't have any usurpation of your right to do freedom of contract, to set poverty pay and all the rest of it, and unfair contracts. That would be the first step towards the rule by the vulgar mob. They said that property rights were sacred. So the Whigs, they thought that most people, they were so uncouth and uncivilized, they shouldn't be allowed to vote. This was rather similar to the modern liberal view of the independence of the judiciary. We can't allow the masses to vote on these things. It's simply not appropriate. Or on Brexit, oh, well, they're too stupid, the vote doesn't count. So we say that democracy doesn't apply to the public opinion because many people are bigoted and punishments will be too cruel. People are too impassioned. People are not sufficiently clued up on these things. So this is a key principle of the judiciary, that an uninformed choice is no choice at all. Most people are uninformed, therefore they can't make a choice. So too, Whigs would have helped with the working class and voting, even a lot of the middle class. Most people know little and care less about politics, but remember, till the Great Reform Act, like 5% of men could vote at most, no women. So we have to be careful about who we admit to the pale of the Constitution. Anyway, so they thought that the views of the ignorant masses merited very little consideration indeed. Anyway, so they allowed a wide degree of latitude to freedom of expression, but the restrictions today would be seen as unacceptable, saying you couldn't blaspheme. The Whigs, they tried to spread their views abroad. They weren't terribly successful. They thought they wanted to support Protestantism and parliamentary government. They wanted to keep the established churches, but not to discriminate against Protestants outside the established churches too much. Often they approved of anti-Catholic discrimination. So the Whigs were on the side of the Enlightenment, but they were dubious about some of those who excoriated Christianity or wanted republicanism. So they said we need to reassess our institutions, be more rational, some sort of reform. So Whigs said, well, French Revolution, oh, that's good because it shows their system is bad, it's not our one's good. But then some radicals within the Whigs said, we have to go further, something close to a revolution in the British Isles. And your average Whig was frightened at that point. It's easy for the Tories, they're completely against the French Revolution. It's easy for the radicals, they're completely in favour. The Whigs have mixed feelings about it. So they're limited in their views, that they sort of vacillate a bit, hang around the middle. Sometimes it's the right thing to do, sit on the fence. So the Whigs thought they were humane and that they were broad-minded. They didn't regard there being the slightest contradiction between this and believing people should be flogged for various crimes and that people should be publicly hanged for stealing just, a horse or something, or a sheep. So many of them were racist, and that was common at the time, and few of them were troubled by slavery. The late 18th century, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade was formed with Whigs and Tories in it, but most Whigs had no problem with slavery. So women shouldn't have any political rights. Your average Whig in the 18th century would have said that. So their liberalism was very, very relative and very much of its time. Remember, we didn't use the word liberal in relation to politics until the 19th century. So in the late 18th century, the Whigs tended towards reform, even if it was a very minor reform. Most Tories were against. They wanted to grant more men the right to vote. Only a few more men, probably. Make the representation not so inconsistent between the boroughs and the counties. Some counties had huge, some boroughs were tiny, some were huge. So they didn't want reform that was too quick or too wide-ranging. But some radicals broke off in impatience over this. The Whigs usually disagreed with the radicali, but they said the radicals should be allowed to voice their views. So anyway, so the Whig view of history has long since been excoriated by Tories, people saying it ought to be debunked. David Hume called it the Whig fallacy, as I said. Some Tories spoke up for Charles, the king who chose to die, rather than the faith denied. Charles, the king and martyr. Or even James II. They thought Cromwell was like the Antichrist. They thought the country became a little freer after 1688. So the Tories saw the state as an organism. They were very sceptical about the least reform, not absolutely against it. They believed that the British Constitution was definitely superior, and they thought that the UK had an excellent balance between monarchy, the aristocracy, and the elected element, whereas the Whigs wanted more reform of the elected element. So the Tories did not concern themselves with the domestic affairs of other countries, or think that their ideology was good for export. It was all about being natural, what's natural to a country. As Edmund Burke said, the rights we have are natural to us. It's because they're right for us, not because they have universal applicability. So the Tories thought they should have an expedient policy, pursue the national interest, weren't terribly concerned about ethics, and thought that they should sometimes forge alliances with Catholic countries or dictatorial governments. The Tories wanted to uphold the paramountcy of the established churches and so on. Hello there from Australia, talk and tech mum. Anyway, anyway, where was I about this? So the Whigs and the Tories, they both into anti-Catholic discrimination. Some attempt to relieve us of the discrimination against us with the Catholic Relief Bill in 1780, but Lord George Gordon led the huge campaigns against it, and the massive rioting in which hundreds of people were killed, shot dead by the army mostly. So anyway, a few Tories thought there should be equality for Catholics, certainly by the 1820s, but no popery was a powerful slogan for both the major parties. Anyway, so some Tories acknowledged the British state was not perfect, shock horror, but said that the people couldn't amend it because the whole system would fall down, or be the downfall of the whole thing. Whereas Whigs said, no, we can have substantial reform. So the Tories are being a party of altar and throne. The Earl of Eldon, this judge who went to my college, Univ, is the early 19th century. He said that there's the established church, not to make the church political, but to make the state religious. Hello there, Sutherland from the United States. So the Tories were ardent monarchists. They believed that the crown ought to maintain influence and have these powers of patronage. They regarded the ousting a monarch as absolutely outrageous. Then they even supported putting deposed monarchs back on their thrones abroad. Anyway, both parties were skeptical about state interference. They believed the state had to have an overriding reason in order to intrude into personal affairs, to enter your house and so on. So, dipsomania, drug abuse, child abuse, or whatever, that was no business of the state. You can beat your child up very badly. So long as you don't actually kill them, that's up to you. Chastise your children. And they said they wish the night watchman state. The state should only step in an absolute emergency. So they believed in having a minimal state because this allowed people the widest degree of latitude to run their own lives as they saw fit. They're a bit libertarian in this regard, but not in religious affairs. Certainly on economic affairs they were libertarian, and saying, yeah, you're selling drugs, that's fine. That's a completely innocent thing to do and could be a laudable thing to do. You can be a respectable member of society, like the Honourable East India Company. So many of these politicians were Nawabs. They'd made their money with trading onto the East. And so public health was no reason to take away private liberty. Don't want state interference of the state poking its nose into private affairs. So A.J.P. Taylor said, in the 18th century, the only time you saw the state was when you saw a postman. That was it. The state was so small. So both parties wanted to do little to relieve the lot of the poor, and many people were desperately poor, living in abject poverty. There's a parish rate, there's a local tax to pay for the workhouses, high in some parishes, low in others. We want to be taxed as little as possible. So the conditions of workhouse are dreadful because we're spending so much little money on the infirm, on unwed mothers, on geriatrics, and on foundlings. So the conditions there were dreadful, were deliberately horrific, and people were fed these sort of starvation diets. So someone would only throw himself on the mercy of the workhouse if he was absolutely desperate. As a sort of masterly inactivity, this is the idea. If you're too good to the poor, then they'll all claim benefit and they won't actually work. Make it less eligible than actually working your fingers to the bone. Do something by doing nothing. And these ideas later animated the American Revolution. Okay, he who governs less governs least, says Thomas Jefferson. It was only acceptable to intervene on certain issues if these were of vital public concern. Upholding the Christian faith was one of them. I know it seems peculiar to us today. So this is a time when there's no minimum wage, no state benefits, no child benefit, all the rest of it. Healthcare and education, that's your problem. If your parents choose to never send you to school, fine. Children have no right to go to school. So there are a few charity hospitals and scholarships, but these are few and far between. So a lot of people missed out what we now consider to be their right. Whigs were all in favour of this. Minimal spending. No state schools really is a parish responsibility. Churches, charities, businesses, they provide schooling. So the church believed we mustn't have the state being too strong, and we must have monarchs to keep politicians in their place. The Whigs thought if a monarch or anyone has too much power, it'll turn tyrannical. So they didn't like searching houses without a warrant. Billeting soldiers in houses mustn't be done. They said we don't interrogate under torture. Anyway, so the Whigs spoke on doing things on behalf of the people, just not allowing the people to vote. So the people meant the rich for them. But some of the rights they were upholding were for everyone, even including the poor, like fair trials. So the Tories did not have such a sort of settled view of history. They largely seem to accept that history is messy and it can't be squished into fitting any framework. So they believed in the Christian notion of the fall of man. We're imperfect, we rebelled against God. This is the world, this is a sort of vale of tears in which we're in. So man is often bad, and by nature so must be kept in check by strong laws and severe punishments. The Tories were much easier to convince on curtailing rights when it was necessary, especially when there's a war on or something. And they thought that free speech could be abridged and people should be thrown into jail without trial or charge, internment, habeas corpus suspended. Oh, there's a war on. So much more into militarism, I suppose. So the Whigs had reservations about this, but they sometimes went along with it. But Lord Chatham, he's the Pitt the Elder, he was a Whig Prime Minister. He said, necessity is the excuse of tyrants, the creed of slaves. But he'd gone along with this sort of thing when he was PM. So the Tories thought they were very patriotic, and the Whigs were anti-patriotic. The Whigs would say they were patriotic, but they're also a bit cosmopolitan. They regarded the Whigs as sort of the Tories kind of country bumpkins and closed-minded. There's some truth in that, bit of a caricature. The Whigs saw them as being a bit more internationalist. So both parties thought that the upper classes were born to rule. They thought that only the gentry should be aldermen or MPs. The lower orders should simply accept the judgment of their social superiors. It was sort of neo-feudal. So remember the Marquis of Salisbury in the late 19th century saying not everyone should be allowed to read. I know he's a Tory, but still. Anyway, considerable degree of anti-Catholicism in both parties. And as there was in the population at all. Join the army if you hate the French and down the Pope. That was a late 18th century recruiting poster for the British Army. So Dr. Mitchell was a world expert on Whigs. The Whig world he wrote, and he taught me, my tutor at UNIV. But one of the things he said, the thing is, the people. Whigs, when it came to voting, they meant only the property classes, tiny percentage. But the people, when it came to habeas corpus, they meant property rights, they meant everyone, even the poor had to have those. And some Whigs said everyone should be allowed to vote on the basis of property because every man owns something, even if it's just his clothes. I say, come on, got to own many acres. A lot of rentable value, or if you're a tenant at will, it had to be a huge rent you're paying. So Whig historicism is perhaps ahistorical. It's determinist. It assumes that history has some sort of motor driving it in a particular direction in favour of parliamentary government, and it's this sort of childish division into good guys and bad guys. So it's trying to make moral pronouncements. It's very much not value-free history. It's very judgmental. So it's too one-sided. It's too emotional. So it's completely subjective. It reduces everything to this battle over parliamentary government. But if we give too many people the vote, then they'll go against parliamentarianism. We're back to tyranny. So it considers past controversies to be about present controversies, which again is ahistorical. It doesn't accept that things can happen without a good reason, or things can be just messy. It often succumbs to this temptation to twist history, to massage things. This is the conclusion on which I base my facts. So that's just a very brief précis of Whig history. Please book lessons with me. Hire me as a tour guide. Follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And donate to me on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com, or indeed Patreon. Good night.